Welcome, everyone. This lovely, beautiful Thursday evening in California. We were just talking about the snow on the East Coast, and so we feel kind of guilty for being here in the West. Welcome to this winter quarter's first, I think, and only, in fact, iteration of the Western History Lecture Series, co-sponsored by the History Department and the Bill Lane Center for the American West. It is my great pleasure to be able to introduce Professor Beth Lew-Williams from Princeton University this evening. Beth is a professor of history and the director of the program in Asian American Studies at Princeton University. Beth is one of the most dynamic and influential historians of her generation, certainly of race and immigration in the United States. Beth earned her BA from Brown and her PhD right here at Stanford under the supervision of our very own Gordon Chang, who we're delighted to have here tonight. Her first book, The Chinese Must Go, I've taught it many times, out from Princeton University Press in 2018. Is that right? 2018. Excuse me, Harvard University Press. I actually have it written down. It's my publisher too, so I feel terrible. This is a landmark study. It is brilliantly maps the tangled relationships between local racial violence, federal immigration policy, and U.S. foreign relations. This book's impact was widely recognized, earning major accolades, including the Ray Allen Billington Prize and the LSW Hawley Prize from the Organization of American Historians. Her scholarship consistently appears in our profession's most prestigious journals, including the Journal of American History and Modern American History. Um, Beyond her research, Beth is a celebrated teacher, honored with Princeton's President's Award for Distinguished Teaching, and just this year, she was also elected to the Society for American Historians. On a personal note, I had the great pleasure of meeting Beth for the first time this year in Rome when she was recipient of the Dan David Prize for Historical Excellence. And we actually, I can say this about no other historian, I think, or American historian. We actually walked through the Sistine Chapel together, basically by ourselves, only with cleaners there, in fact. So we basically woke up the Vatican. So this was, and we had many important conversations about history and empathy and teaching in modern, these sort of troubled times. But it is my great pleasure to welcome Beth, who's going to be talking to us about her latest book, Doe Chinaman. So thank you.
Oh, it's such a pleasure to come back to Stanford. It's been a while, about 15 years since I lived here, and so it's really wonderful. Thanks so much to Catherine for inviting me, to Gordon as well, and then I think Tina and Lydia helped put all this together. So I really appreciate it. Okay, so today I'm going to talk about my new book that came out in September. And what I want to start with is to talk about this word, Chinaman, which is so prominently on the book and is an ugly word. Um, so the word Chinaman in the 19th century was very liberally used in the United States, right? It was used in newspapers and by lawmakers. It was used in courts, and it was used in everyday speech. And it was used to describe a racial identity that was assumed to be innate at the time. And it's interesting to me that even when communicating with white people, Chinese people use this term, Chinaman. I think the term Chinaman always denoted, racial inferiority of some level, but it certainly over time has become a more aggressive racial slur. In my sources, Chinaman, or the longer Doe Chinaman, is ubiquitous. It's something that I encounter all of the time when I'm going and looking at 19th century records. And I was really struck by the use of Doe Chinaman, which was often used in legal records, not just for someone who, had died, so a John Doe as we usually think of it, but just for living people that are sort of unidentifiable or anonymous. Um, and I think it gives us a sense how the Chinese were viewed at the time by the government and by white Americans. Um, and so even when white Americans did try to write down Chinese people's names, they did so poorly, bad transliterations, haphazard spellings, and often they didn't try at all. And so one of the sources I think that captures this the strongest is the 1852 census in California. And so in 1852, California did a full census. In San Francisco, for example, they counted 2,581 Chinese people, but they only listed about 2 dozen by name, right? Everyone else was just Chinaman. This image is actually from Tuolumne County. And we see at the top, we have John Chinaman and then just Chinaman all the way down. But these are individuals. They have different ages. But it gives you a sense of that the way the government is making these people anonymous. Um, Also, while we're looking at a census record, I'll point out a couple other things, right? There's some things we'd expect: place of birth, China; last residence, China; profession, trade, or occupation, China. And then the other interesting thing here is color. The three options above are white, black, or mulatto, and they are all labeled white, which I think is interesting. Um, and so this gives us a sense of sort of how anonymous the Chinese have become in U.S. archives, in part because they were seen as sort of interchangeable or inscrutable at the time. We can also see this, I think, with visual sources in addition to textual sources. This is one of the sources I found in my archival research that I found most arresting. So it's 2,700 boy babies of San Francisco Chinatown in 1889. I found it in the scrapbook of a man named Jesse Brown Cook. He was a police officer in San Francisco, at one time head of the Chinatown Squad in San Francisco. He eventually became the chief of police of San Francisco in the 20th century. Um, and he has many, many scrapbooks in Bancroft Library across the bay. And in one page, he has this. Okay, so what are we looking at? We're looking at a photo collage at a time when photographs were fairly rare. Somebody has taken individual photos of Chinese babies and children, cut them up, and reassembled them, and then photographed them again. When I first saw this, I was like, "What in the world is this? And what produced, how did somebody produce such a thing?" Eventually, I um, I hypothesize that what happened here is that the Chinese, like everyone else, wants to, get a photo of their newborn child. They took a liking to studio photography in San Francisco. Go into a studio, work with a white photographer who took a picture of their child, send a baby announcement home, something like that. But instead, what this photographer is doing is also, in addition to taking a photo for the family, sort of also taking copies that then they could make and arrange into this sort of anonymous mass, something that could be sold to white people as a curiosity, and probably sold to Jesse Brown Cook, the police officer. So, in other words, a white photographer likely crafted this collage in secret, right, without the customer's knowledge or consent, because few would have endorsed such a practice, an inauspicious practice of cutting photographs. And likely these families didn't know, right, that the faces of their children, their cherished children, had been compiled into this anonymous mass and then sold to strangers. And certainly they had no idea that their pictures would end up in a police officer's scrapbook, right, alongside images of criminals. Um, I think for white Americans like the policeman Cook, the collage effect is ominous, right? And I think the nature of that sort of threat of this image would have been immediately clear to them in the 19th century, right? A few years before this, in 1882, the United States had declared the Chinese to be undesirable, and then they had barred most Chinese immigrants, laborers, from entering the United States. And in subsequent decades, the federal government had passed what is known as a series of Chinese exclusion laws that pledged to stop Chinese immigration, although often failed. But border control was only part of the problem the whole time, right? Because there were Chinese already in the country at this point, around 100,000. So what about these Chinese already in the country? And these infants, their parents, and the larger Chinese diaspora in the American West. Um, and so I think this image in many ways captures like two of the problems that I'm trying to address in this new book. One is simply the anonymous nature of the Chinese in the American archive. How do we get from something like this to imagining not what this, I think when we look at this, it's very easy to like sort of look along the grain, see what the photographer saw, see what Jesse Brown Cook saw, this anonymous mass. But in my book, I'm really trying to sort of attempt to flip the image, to imagine what instead the world would look like if we could be those children looking out as opposed to others looking in. So the first problem I'm trying to address is simply that of the anonymity. Um, the second is about the fact that this photo collage is placed in a policeman's scrapbook, right? I think this evokes for me the second problem, which is that we're still really trying to understand the role of policing or social control in the lives of Chinese residents in the 19th century. And I think a lot of this is because of what our focus has been up to this point, especially when we're talking about regulation or law. The focus has been repeatedly the border, right? In the history of Chinese in America, I think that the border has, caught our attention and held it. And so many of our histories, including my first history, is about this, Chinese migration and the attempt to stop it. But in long before the Chinese exclusion laws and really long after their first adoption as well, Chinese were facing laws within the country. They're facing a racial regime within the country every day. And that's what I'm trying to do with this book, is to look at what does the racial regime look like for Chinese on a daily basis. So here are my central questions. The first, I mean, these are pretty straightforward, right? And they're very much. I went into this project knowing the answer. The first question is, what were the Chinese permitted to do in the American West? What was permissible in daily life? What would happen if they walked into a restaurant or tried to, rent a property? Things like that. What is permissible for them to do? The second question I have is, if there are sort of embedded rules about what is permissible in daily life for Chinese immigrants, to what extent are these rules written in law? Or how much of it is actually in the law as opposed to just sourced through social norms or things like that? And then my third question, which is always the most important but also the trickiest, is how is it the Chinese lived with this? How did they endure it? How did they negotiate it? And how do they resist it? To answer these questions, I turn to a set of archives that are relatively untapped when it comes to Chinese immigration. I looked at local legal records for the most part, trying to find out, at the township or municipality level, and then also at the state level or territory level, how is it that the Chinese are being regulated? So I drove around a lot. I'm a native Californian. Not only was I here for graduate school, but I'm also a native Californian. I dropped off the kids with the grandparents and drove around California and visited archives. I ended up visiting 33 archives. This is a few of them. If you are from the area or if you're a historian, you may be able to pick out a few of these. Like we've got the very glamorous Huntington here, which is sort of gardens for everybody else, which is nice. And the very unglamorous, this like single door, is the San Jose history, which is very close by. It's lovely, but not a glorious door. Yeah, I started taking photos of all the doors that I entered along the way, because just to kind of get a visual aspect of this. The other thing I did is I went to a lot of operating courthouses because in some counties it was these records, these criminal and civil records are still in the courthouse. So we have the Oakland courthouse here, Sierra County courthouse. I think that's the main two courthouses I have here. So those are some examples of where I was going. Uh, Here's the inside of one of those archives, the Center for Sacramento History, one of my favorites. Here, these bundles are legal court transcripts, is what we're looking at here. I found all sorts of interesting things. This is a diary from a tax collector. Not does not necessarily sound like the most exciting thing you've ever heard of, but it was really quite amazing because it's a man tasked with getting taxes from Chinese miners, and so it gives us a sense of what that practice looked like. How is it that you get taxes? And the answer is you sort of set upon Chinese camps in the dark and demand money. But so it is really interesting what we can find in these little archives. But mostly what I was looking at were legal records. And this is an example of like the one of the fattest legal records I ever found in the Huntington Library. And what I think is really interesting about these local legal records is that they have the potential to give us sort of the Chinese voice or Chinese voices in a way that most sources do not at this time. In fact, I think that these local legal records, if you sort of put them all together, all of these legal records are the largest American archive of Chinese voices in the 19th century in the country. Because when Chinese people came into court, they and testified, their words were often translated and transcribed in real time. And so we get sort of snippets of people's lives in these documents. We also get a sense of the John Doe persists, though, right? We get some vision of people's lives, but also a lot of anonymous. So this is where they took the script for the front of my book. Is there? It's right there. It's John Doe Chinaman. Um, Among these legal records were also visual records. Perhaps most dramatic are the mugshots. So I thought I'd just show you a few of these mugshots. These are all pages from mug books in different places. All of them are. Just to give you a sense of how I try to read these visual records for the kinds of history that I'm looking at. Okay, so I'm going to start over here. Here on your left is Ah Lung. This is a mugshot from his entry into San Quentin. He was arrested for statutory rape. And I write more about that history in my book. But one of the things that's most arresting about this photo series really, is that we see in this sort of sequential series the cutting of his hair, the cutting of his queue uh, which was a hairstyle that was mandated by the Qing court. It meant the forcible cutting of his hair would have rendered him an outcast in China. So it's in some ways this experience of being brought into San Quentin is also making it very difficult for him to ever to go back to China again. He can kind of capture this in the photo series. The next one over is from Sacramento. It's from a Sacramento mug book. What's really striking about this image is that there's two people in it. Every other image is what you would picture, sort of like one person photographed with a description of their crime. These two men, Ah Lee and Ah Jo, were arrested together for the crime of sodomy. And then they were photographed together, which is very, very rare. I've never seen it again or before and ever. But I think it gives you a sense of that even in these records that are produced by policing, we can also see at least like suggestive glimpses of the complications, the intimacies of people's lives. And so that's, I think, one of the most striking images I've encountered. The next one over here is from San Francisco. In San Francisco, they compiled an entire mug book, which they called the Tong Wars. This is from the 20th century, probably in the 1920s, maybe into the 1930s, where they were attempting to sort of figure out these tongs, these gangs, Chinese gangs. And so they compiled a mug book that looks unlike any other, in part because clearly they were raiding people's homes in order to sort of appropriate private photos and make them into photos that could be used for policing. So that's why we have, our muscular man here, clearly not intended as a mugshot originally. Um, there's also in other pages, like there's Valentines, right? They're in hearts. And so there's something like beautifully alive about images like this, but also just heart wrenching, right? That these, again, these personal photos are being brought into the policing system. The last one here is from Downeyville, California, which is Sierra County, um, up in the Sierras. What's striking about this one is that these are not criminals. They're not images of people that have been arrested. Instead, these are photos, immigration photos, when the Chinese, under Chinese exclusion, were forced to register with the Gary Act in 1892. They were forced to sort of take photos of them and have documents to show their ability to be in the United States. In Downeyville, somehow the sheriff got a copy of each of these photos and then made his own mug book, which allowed him to then track any of the Chinese in his town. So this gives you a sense of a really early example in the 1890s of how police work and immigration control are overlapping or starting to overlap, right? Um, so in addition to these beautiful visual sources, I also did something that's a lot less beautiful, which is spreadsheets, along with a student. She was a graduate student at Princeton, Hannah Postel, who now, we've been working on this so long, she's now an assistant professor of public policy at Duke. So along with this collaborator, Hannah Postel, I worked to put together a database of anti-Chinese laws. Um, and what we did, with her technical skills, I should point out, not mine, with her technical skills and my background, we tried to, use sort of big data methods to find as many of these laws as we could. Scholars had previously shown that there were laws regulating the Chinese at the local and state level, but we didn't have a sense of how many or how widespread or if they're the same in lots of places or not. And so what we did was we collected all the state laws in 3 states, Oregon, Washington, and California, and then we collected all the laws we could in 182 municipalities. And by all the laws, I mean literally every law that was passed in these places that is available. We digitized them all, uh, put them into little spreadsheets like this, and then searched them using sort of machine learning assisted keyword searches to find all of the relevant laws that regulated Chinese. And in the end, we found that these Western states and territories and towns passed more than 5,000 laws that we believe has significant impact on Chinese lives, right? So laws and also custom regulated things like the Chinese people's ability to work, their ability to operate a business, to own property, to testify in court, to seek education, to operate a business, to form families. For the Chinese, these laws, I think, represent sort of both more and less than they seem on paper. More because sometimes there was this unspoken threat of violence that lay behind them. It's a $5 fine, but also there's other things at stake, but often less as well, because a lot of these laws fell to Chinese resistance. They were found unconstitutional and taken down. Uh, when I say that there's 5,000 laws, I should further tell you what kind of laws I'm talking about. What we determined over time is that we thought there were sort of 3 categories of laws that were important to look at. So some of these laws are what we called identity-based. That is, laws that named the Chinese, their racial identity, or laws that targeted the Chinese based on their alien status, their non-citizen status. Um, the reason that we see these 2 sets of laws they're quite different, right? The ones that name the Chinese or name white people, and those that privilege citizens or disadvantage aliens as the same, as both identity-based. It's because the Chinese were unable to become citizens at the time. There were laws against Chinese naturalization. So for both both their alien status and their racial status was an immutable category for Chinese immigrants, right? You can't change that. So it is identity based. But we also found laws that were regulated the Chinese based on their behavior. This is a set of laws that were sort of associated with Chinese stereotypes mostly, or actual practices. So one example is there's a bunch of basket laws that say that you can't walk down the sidewalk carrying baskets on a pole strung over your shoulder, right? So this is a practice only associated with the Chinese. And so that's the sort of behavior-based laws that we were looking at. And then we have this larger category we call general outcast laws. They look a lot for sort of early Americanists at like poor laws, right? And these laws were regulating lots of people, not just the Chinese, various outsiders, itinerants, unwanted people, Black people also are caught up in these general outcast laws. These are things like vagrancy laws, nuisance laws. But we thought of these laws as really central because if we didn't include them in our sample, we would be not looking at most of the laws the Chinese are being arrested for. And because, we did a lot of sort of trying to get inspired by what African American history has done before, looking at things like Jim Crow, which is an overlapping time period. And there in Jim Crow, vagrancy laws, nuisance laws, these sorts of things are essential to the way that Black people are being regulated. And so we were trying to similarly, in part, to be able to compare what we're doing to Jim Crow, to want to look at these laws as well. Okay. Um, so I thought I'd just give you a couple examples. Again, so an identity-based law, this is actually from Sacramento, is there was a specific law against Chinese wash houses in Sacramento, passed in 1879. An example of a behavior-based law would be the lodging house laws, or what's also known as the cubic air laws. First passed in San Francisco in 1870, but then it became really popular to pass these lodging house laws. What the law said was that for every person that's living in a boarding house, they needed to have 500 cubic feet of air. What that looks like, I will never be able to picture, right? Like what, trying to imagine, we don't have 500 cubic feet of air each, I think, in this room. But you kind of imagine what it actually meant in practice was that, police could raid a Chinese boarding house, look around and say, there's not 500 cubic feet of air in here per person, and then arrest everybody. So this is an example of a facially race-neutral law. It says nothing about the Chinese. It was applied entirely to Chinese people. We can look at arrest records to see that. So it's associated with sort of stereotypes of the overcrowded Chinese living. And then an example of general outcast laws are things like nuisance laws. This is a photo taken in right about the turn of the 20th century in San Francisco, and it shows sort of the back alleys of San Francisco. And you can imagine that they can just kind of come through and say this is a fire risk, and that is also a way that people were policed. Okay. I think one of the best ways to understand these laws is to consider what they did. So over time, I'm arguing that they forged sort of a racial regime that touched every aspect of people's lives, right? They made explicit some unspoken rules for Chinese behavior. They were trying to ensure sort of a sense of impermanence and subordination for Chinese residents. And I think that when people passed these laws, they had many different motivations and they had different objectives for different laws. But I think for the Chinese who had to live with them, they actually were more simple, right? Together, what these laws did was set preconditions for Chinese life, right? They put rules essentially into place that governed Chinese economic, political, cultural, and spatial behavior. Um, and in the book, I describe this as a process of conditional inclusion. What I mean by that is that, the Chinese could live in the United States despite exclusion, like the people that are already here can live in the United States, and they might even be able to thrive in the United States, but they had to do so under certain conditions, right? They had to do so under that meant that their belonging was conditional, and it's through these social control laws that we really see those conditions come through. What I want to do with the rest of my time is to talk through just one example of this, so sort of one area of law or one area of the way that Chinese found their lives to be conditional. And what I've chosen to talk about is residential segregation, because I think that this is one that it's easier for us to sort of picture. We have some image of what segregation looks like. Okay. So, as an example, I'm going to talk about how Chinese segregation was constructed and enforced on the West Coast. There's several ways we can look at Chinese segregation, and we can see it in the archive as a historian. Sometimes you see it in photographs like this. This is out of Portland. We've got Chinese houses here, and above we've got the white housing. You can see it very dramatically align, right? Here we have a visual of segregation. We can also sometimes see it in, Chinese people remembering their lives at this time. So here's an example from a man named Panny Low. His oral history, his interview was recorded by the Survey of Race Relations, which went around studying the Oriental problem in the 1920s, early 1920s. All of those records are here at the Hoover, the Survey of Race Relations. But they did a lot of sort of interviews. And so I think it's interesting what Panny Low, he talks a lot about many things, but he talks about residential segregation. And I'll say he testified in English. This is what is written down, and you'll hear it's a choppy English. We can't know if that's how he spoke or if it's how he was perceived by the white interviewers, things like that. But I'll read it aloud for us here. He said, "When in Portland, which is about 1908, I want to live in a residential district, but they make lots of trouble if you try to live outside Chinatown. One friend, he born in this country, he buy a $6,000 house in the Rose City district. White people make hell a lot of trouble for him. They take it to court, he fight it. Just the same, they kick him out. He can own house, but no live there. I think that very unjust. Those people very uncivilized, have no regard for humanity. So when me friend had so much trouble, I decided to stay in Chinatown." So we have here sort of a very complicated, he's talking not just about the pressure to stay in Chinatown, but also a story of, a friend who attempted to live outside and even fought in court to live outside and found it to be untenable. We can also see Chinese segregation in maps. This is in my first book. I use Sanborn fire insurance maps a lot to see this. So you can see very clearly marked Chinese occupied places. Chinatown. This is Eureka, California, for example. And then scholars can also look at it in the census. And so for here, I'm drawing again from sociologists and my collaborator Hannah Postel. What she did was she used several of the classic measures of segregation that have been used to study Black segregation. One of those classic measures is the dissimilarity index, which essentially takes a census page and it sort of says that approximates a city block, right? And then compare census pages, and it's a measure essentially of how many people would need to move within a given city in order for it to be perfectly integrated. Right? So perfectly integrated, nobody would have to move. So it would be a dissimilarity index of 0, right? But, for example, in Sacramento in 1880, the dissimilarity index was 0.78. So that is 78% of people in Sacramento would have to move to recombine this to get an integrated place, right? And it's even more dramatic in San Francisco at the time. 87% of people would need to move to fully integrate San Francisco in 1880. To just give you a sense, this is comparable, if not higher, than Black segregation in most of the major southern cities at this time in the 1880s, right? So if we we can compare this to Atlanta, Baltimore, Charleston, New Orleans. These places are similarly, or sometimes in case of San Francisco is more segregated, right? So this is highly segregated. What caused Chinese segregation? Lots of things. So I'm going to just sort of quickly at the end here just sort of run down these things. It's a little bit of a list, but I think it's an interesting one. Um, one of the most clear and dramatic ways in which people tried to segregate Chinese is simply write it into the law to say that they can be removed, these removal laws. Um, and so the California Constitution of 1879 simply says that, right? It gives the power to the legislature to allow all incorporated cities to simply remove their Chinese outside of the city if they wish. When this was written into the Constitution, it was already clearly unconstitutional. It was in violation of the 14th Amendment, and a lot of people knew that it was. So, for example, when Sacramento brought forward a bill to do just that, to sort of declare a date and move all the Chinese out by law, the city attorney took one look at this bill and said, "Nope, that's not going to stand up. That's just going to waste our money. You cannot do that." And so we see examples of attempted laws, but where they get stopped short. The same thing happens in Portland. They write a very explicit removal law, and the city attorney says, "Nope, that's going to violate the 14th Amendment." However, not everybody listens to their city attorney, or maybe the city attorney is not as forthright. Says in San Francisco, they do pass a removal law known as the Bingham Ordinance, which essentially would have barred the Chinese from Chinatown and moved them into an area that was full of slaughterhouses. Um, Chinese plaintiffs fought this in court and won in releasing in 1890, the same year. And the judge, Judge Sawyer, when he was ruling in this case, he said, quote, "It was so obvious that this racial zoning ordinance was in direct violation of the Constitution, treaties with China, and U.S. statutes that, quote, I shall not waste more time or words in discussing the matter." Okay, so they try very explicit racial zoning laws, and they do so in the 19th century, which is before this is attempted against Black people. So the first racial zoning laws that we see attempted against Black people come from 1910 and later. And again, those laws will also be found unconstitutional, this time at the Supreme Court level in 1917. Um, but racial zoning laws are not the only way that law could regulate where Chinese people lived. Another more successful and enduring set of laws are alien land laws. Um, so these are laws that prohibited either Chinese, people from China, ability to own land, or just non-citizens, aliens, ability to own land. Alien land laws are actually very old. They can be dated back into the colonial period to early America, but it's only really at this moment in the late 19th century when they come to California that they take on this racial nature, that they're attempting to regulate a particular race. And you can see that here. Some of them are very explicit, that they're saying no Chinese. Some of them more loose about alienage. Um, they were applied most aggressively to mining land and agricultural land, but some of them did apply to real estate. And even if they didn't, much like the racial zoning laws, even if they didn't clearly apply to real estate, they could be used, right, to intimidate people and tell people that they could not buy property. So the third thing I want to mention, I wrote about in my first book, that is anti-Chinese expulsions. So violent attempts to force the Chinese out of neighborhoods or of cities. In my first book, one of the things I do is I document, that more than 165 communities across the West sort of attempted to expel their Chinese neighbors. Not all of them very successfully. Um, and that, this was vigilante violence. A lot of it was endorsed by city officials, and so sort of the difference between sort of the public and the state acting is not always clear. This is forms of vigilante violence, and vigilantes often claim that they're acting on behalf of the state, an incapacitated state, or a state that could not do what it should be doing. In my first book, I talk mostly about how this violence, this violent racial politics, push for Chinese exclusion at the national level and border control. In my second book, I came back to this because I wanted to look at, okay, yeah, but what does it do to people's lives on a daily basis, right? How is it that violence, what I found is that violence is also creating segregation on the ground. One of the clearest examples is San Jose, which this is an image of the burning of Market Street Chinatown, one of the first Chinatowns in San Jose, which was very much in the city center of San Jose, right, at the historic plaza. After this was burned, then the Chinese were moved into planned areas in San Jose. So the next two Chinatowns are just sort of, they were actually described as reservations, um, uh, owned by a particular landowner who would say, like, this is where the Chinese can build. And so violence could also play a part in segregation. Another example from Truckee. So Truckee, one of the original Chinatowns, was like, on that side of the river where all the houses are. But the community was adverse to having the Chinese sort of in downtown Truckee, and so that Chinatown burned and then was moved across the river. What we see here is a deed from Charles Crocker. And I think what's interesting is this deed shows the Tahoe Business Association. So again, the city is involved, or the town, purchasing land from Crocker. And on the deed, it says block land for Chinatown, right? So that's very clearly like sort of city planning, right, of where the Chinese can be contained. Um, In addition, there are also private legal instruments that become common. You may have heard of racial restrictive covenants. I know this has been in the news in California because they're trying to finally get rid of them all. They're still in people's deeds. So basically, the practice of people writing into the deed that only certain people can live here, white people or only certain people cannot live here. Racial restrictive covenants became very popular as a tool of segregation. They're strongly associated with Black segregation. They actually were first, as far as I can tell, developed to regulate Chinese. I found this one, which is from San Jose in 1884. It's an unusual one. It says the Chinese can live here except if they're expelled. Then breaks their lease. Like if all Chinese are expelled from San Jose, this breaks their lease, which is an interesting thing to write into a lease. Or in Ventura County, where this lease simply says that that Chinaman may not own or rent this property. Um, and this was challenged by this was challenged by a white property owner and his Chinese tenants, and it was actually found to be unconstitutional in 1890, these racial restrictive covenants. However, I think it had sort of an unintended consequence that that ruling, when it was published in all the law journals, a lot of lawyers and judges said, I'm not sure that that is clearly unconstitutional. And it seems like almost that ruling, even though it was in favor of the Chinese, like spread knowledge of this idea, right? And eventually becomes very popular, not only on the West Coast, but targeting Black residents. It makes its way to the South and the North, targeting Black residents after 1904. Um, And then there's real estate practices. We always know realtors are highly involved. Um, I found this set of sources again from the Survey of Race Relations, which is here in the Hoover, where again, those 1920s social scientists are studying the Oriental problem. It was one of those rare finds where it's like, "Oh my god, these people sent out a survey asking all the questions I want them to ask in the 1920s? How is this possible?" Okay, so because the question and I'm picking here so this is the answer coming from Yolo County, which is my hometown of Davis, so I pick on Yolo. Um, and so it asks in their survey in 1920, it says, "Are there segregated sections in your locality based on the color line? If so, what races are affected?" And it says in Yolo County, the Chinese and Negroes. Uh, is this due to local ordinance or not? I mean, this is I can't I can't imagine that they're asking this thing. And he said, "No, we have no local ordinances." If not, how is it that they're being segregated? And then list by group and by, is it special understanding? And in YOLO, they say it's community custom. It's just community custom. And I think what's amazing about a source like this is it says that quiet part out loud, right? That there's a lot going on that we can't see in the law. It's just through custom, but everybody understands it. That's why it's part of this conditional inclusion. Um, since I'm here at Stanford, I thought I'd pull Palo Alto to see what they had said. Interestingly, they refuse to answer all the top questions as far as I can, but they do have a nice little paragraph here at the bottom, which I'll read to you. It says, "The board has in the past," this is the Realty Board of Palo Alto, "arrived at the decision that it is a matter, the segregation, which cannot be handled by the board other than as a practice among brokers to segregate as far as possible the above nationalities into certain sections in order to prevent the depreciation of properties in other sections." So again, we're saying the quiet part out loud, right? There's, they're saying like, well, it's just we can't do anything officially as a board, but the brokers all understand that this will bring down property values if we allow um, these folks to live where white people are living. Um, and then the last thing I wanted to note is just nuisance and sanitation policing, which I mentioned earlier, that the health department is very much involved. This image is from San Francisco when fears of bubonic plague sort of licensed the health department to destroy dozens, if not 100 buildings in Chinatown. And you can see sort of there's amazing images of just the destruction of these homes, really, that were just sort of Chinatown was seen as a hotbed for plague, and that was enough to sort of um, suggest that their buildings could be destroyed. And this is another way that people can control where people live. Um, and this is just one more image. This is using a fireman's hook to pull down a building. Uh, so, how did the Chinese respond? I've tried to highlight that along the way, so I'll just say a quick sentence or two on this. Um, I think it's striking that they were unable to vote as non-citizens, right? Unable to vote, but they did attempt to participate in the democratic system in some ways, and one of the ways is through petitioning. So they sent petitions to the state legislature. They sent it at the town level, and so they petitioned against things like discriminatory taxes, for school segregation, exclusion from school. Sometimes these petitions are not just a few people. There are hundreds of people sending in a petition and trying to weigh in this indirect means into democracy, although petitioning was much more common during this time period than today. In addition to this, when they were unable to withstand expulsion, they rebuilt elsewhere, right? They avoided places where they were unwanted. They moved sometimes into Chinatowns for more protection. Um, and I think also, unable to reason with extremists, right? They sought better places, more friendly neighbors, that landlords that welcomed them, or at least their rent. So that they were able to sort of slowly and I think carefully try to figure out the unwritten rules and figure out how sort of map out where the friendly spaces were. And then in my book, in part because it's the most visible in the record, I really highlight the way that they turned to the law, right? They sued a lot. There's a lot. It's one. It's really impressive, right? Chinese witnesses and plaintiffs, they challenged things like their expulsion in court. They challenged racial restrictive covenants, as I mentioned. They challenged those racial zoning laws. They also challenged discriminatory taxes of all sorts. Uh, Laundry laws, lodging house, those cubic air laws, they're challenging all of these things in court. They get really used to understanding the courts. In fact, someone even sued Jesse Brown Cook, the head of the Chinatown Squad, that man who collected the disturbing photo collage of babies. Right? Lai Hok Yan filed a legal complaint against him, alleging that Cook had, quote, brutally assaulted, maimed, and injured several Chinese when enforcing city ordinances. His lawyer gave an interview to the press, and he said it's not so much that we want to make an example of Cook, but instead to insist upon having Chinese treated like human beings. Um, and so I thought I'd just end with the image that is on the cover of my book. This is it's written above him. Ah Chui is how he's written. Ah Chui. He was arrested in Sacramento. He had allegedly stolen a box of cigars. For that, he was sentenced to 2 years in San Quentin State Prison. And that's all I know about him because all I have is his shot here in a small description. But with that, I'm happy to take any questions. Sir? Okay, so the question is, when judges ruled in favor of the Chinese, to what extent, how often were they ignored? I think, I'm not going to be able to quantify that in any way. I think that uh, it is remarkable how much judges ruled in favor of the Chinese. I think that it's a testament to the ways that law was functioning at the time. Especially, I think it's a testament to the power of the Reconstruction Amendments, the 14th Amendment in particular. And it's something that, Black plaintiffs went to in the South, and Chinese plaintiffs did as well. And it really sort of changed the way that people were able to regulate the Chinese. To the extent to which they were ignored, I don't see that very often. Sometimes what I do see is that in one town a judge will rule against a set of laws, and then they're still passed in another town, right? Whether this is ignoring it or sort of not communicating is unclear to me. Um, but so there are so laundry laws are an example. There's many ways that Chinese laundries were attempted to be regulated. What's interesting is some of those laundry laws were found to be unconstitutional, and some of them were not. And I find that the sort of they spread. Even the ones that were found to be unconstitutional still spread to multiple locations. So I think that's an example of that. Hmm. Yes. Hi. Okay, so what did Chinese understand about the law? This is a really hard question, right? In legal history, we talk about this, like what is their legal consciousness? What did they understand? Um, I think I don't have a fully satisfactory answer to this. What I do is I dip into Qing law a little bit to try to. So it's an attempt to sort of triangulate, right? Like what systems would they have understood coming from China? How did law function there? And there I use Matt Summers' work, a professor in this department. To some extent, and others' work as well, to try to sort of understand what law looked like there. For example, there's not a clear differentiation between civil and criminal law there, um, and um, and and there's not the same role of lawyers, things like that. But then I also just try to do it based on sort of like how it is that people are acting. So one of the most striking things I find is how much Chinese women are appearing in court, which I think is really interesting. So how is it that they have access to lawyers or understand their rights? I think that that's really interesting, and it gives me maybe more questions than answers. but it gives me a sense of, the Chinese community had regulatory structures within itself, right? And I wonder if women are going outside of those internal regulatory structures because of the ways in which they're disadvantaged, right? They're oppressed or exploited within the Chinese community. So I wonder if that's why they're going to the American legal system. And then the other way we do this is to just look at the few times Chinese talk about the issue. And there are congressional investigations of the Chinese community, um, as there and so sometimes, every once in a while, people ask my questions for me, and they ask, like, "How do you understand?" "How do you know to go to a lawyer?" How do you know? And usually the testimony is pretty simple. It's just like, "Oh, I of course I know how to go to a lawyer. Like, everybody goes to lawyers." Right? You see the person down the street, doing this. And one more thing I'll say on this is that I think that this, like, what we see, this like local going to court experience is really formative for what we're going to see at the federal level when Chinese use the courts extensively fighting Chinese exclusion, trying to get into the country. And we have like landmark immigration, Supreme Court decisions, and things like that. I think a lot of the learning is happening here at the local level. Testimony of descendants. This is tricky, um, in part, it's a fairly small part of the Chinese American community today that is descended from 19th century Chinese community. Gordon is an example of his family was here and in Marysville back to the 1860s, 50s, 1850s. That is a rarity right there. Okay, I think it's like. Yeah, it's in the single digits, the percentage of Chinese Americans that are, back more than 3 generations. My family, it looks like they came over in the 1870s, maybe the 1880s. So again, a rare example. But I think this is unusual. I didn't use descendant stories for this particular book, but I am interested in it. And I had a unique experience this past September when I was able to go to Rock Springs, Wyoming. For some of you may know, Rock Springs is the site of one of the largest anti-Chinese massacres. More than 25 Chinese miners were killed in 1885. And then Chinatown was burned to the ground, and then the other hundreds were driven out of town. And another Stanford grad, who's an archaeologist, Laura Ng, is working on a dig there, looking at the Chinatown that was burned to the ground in 1885, and they were marking the 140th anniversary of this massacre, and and I was invited because my family is actually from Rock Springs, and so I went along with my parents, to what was it's maybe one of the strangest family reunions ever of many or Leo descendants who date back to the early Rock Springs Chinatown. And what's striking to me, meeting all of these descendants, only a few of them from that moment of the massacre, is that these families actually, we like the archaeologists are educating them. Right? These stories have not been passed down. Often it's scholars who've reached out and said, "Do you know that you're descended of?" And often the answer is no, especially with families where they were laborers, and a lot of these stories have been lost. Yes.
Can you maybe expound a little bit more on why there seems to be this big gap in like the local policy, especially the court system? Like it seems like based on your answer to the earlier question too, like the court systems are more rational almost in their approach, but I mean you
Maybe I'm making the courts sound too good. So first, let me explain to you the courts are not that good. The courts are definitely angled against the Chinese. So I'll be very clear on that. One of the ways that they're a difficult space for the Chinese is that there are actually racially based testimony laws that were in effect until 1870. These laws, the first examples in California barred Black people and Native people from testifying in court. And this law, even though it didn't name the Chinese, also was applied to the Chinese as well. And eventually there were laws explicitly making it so Chinese could not testify in court. In both civil and criminal actions. However, I just told you there's lots of testimony. So, how is this the case? It was written in such a way that you could not testify against a white party, which was definitely a disadvantage, right? So it meant that the witness to the murder could not testify, in often case things like that, or if you're bringing a suit against a white person for discrimination, it's a problem if you cannot testify. However, there is lots of opportunity for the Chinese to testify in their own defense. And one of the other ways that they testify is through, and this is sort of grim, but through death inquests. This seems to be a little loophole there. So death inquests, not the actual trial, if there's eventually a trial, Chinese would come forward and testify to the death of their friend or family. Um, so that's an example in which it's really angled against them. Another sort of indication that's very much angled against them is just the incarceration records for the Chinese. And I'm going to put a lot of caveats on this after I say it, but the Chinese were actually incarcerated at the highest rate of any racial group in the 1880s. And in the 1890s, they were surpassed by Native people, but they still had the longest sentences, and they were most likely to be sentenced to life in prison or to death. There's lots of caveats to that because we know that a lot of Black people in the 1890s didn't make it to court, right? So the fact that they're in court is meaningful and are imprisoned as opposed to other kinds of extra legal violence. However, it does give us a sense they're disproportionately incarcerated. So in other words, the court's not all good. I don't want to, but there is still this gap. I think it's really interesting. And you see this, sometimes when the judges are giving instructions to the jury, they say it aloud. They say, um, you know, it is not that there is a white man's law and a Chinese man's law. There is just the law, and you need to apply it. They warn the jury about this. I think there are always those people, right? And I think that it's a powerful and hopeful thing that there are some people that are trying to administer law in this equitable way and really apply the 14th Amendment as it was intended.
Can I follow up to that really quick? I guess, when were they first able to bring cases as plaintiffs? And then can you just say a little bit more about the 14th Amendment and what changes that brought in this context?
Yeah. They were So they found ways to bring cases. They could bring cases, they just couldn't testify. A weird caveat. But when you're bringing a civil case, you make a complaint, and in that complaint, you can put your whole position, even if you can't testify in court. And I think that that was another way that they managed to sort of tell their stories without testifying in court, is one way to say that. Um, the the 14th Amendment, perhaps my favorite amendment, is an amazing thing. Not only does it give us birthright citizenship, so all those born in America are U.S. citizens, but it also promises equal protection under the law. Um, um, and this means that it is, quite explicit that the laws are supposed to act on all people in the same way, regardless of race. And then in the 15th Amendment, they also clarify that this means things like that all people should be able to testify in court. And so it's really with the 15th Amendment that they declare and make very clear. And with the Civil Rights Act, also known as the Enforcement Act of 1870, they make very clear that testimony should be race neutral. All people should be able to testify. Uh, Chinese are still kept out of testifying. There's always this caveat. Despite that, there's a lot of discrimination against Chinese testimony. For example, in exclusion cases, so immigration cases, they write into the law that Chinese people need two white witnesses to testify on their behalf. A Chinese witness saying that they were born in America is not good enough, things like that. So there's still caveats there. Yes. Okay. Yes, sir.
I'm just really intrigued by your comment of Chinese community self-regulated structures. I was just wondering, do you see any situations where those community structures would work with what I call the municipal government or policing forces and, in fact, manage the systems?
Yes. Yeah. I in my book I call it like Chinese vernacular law because I want to emphasize because at the time they were often accused of that the Chinese self-regulation itself was a kind of crime, right? Like that it was like a um sort of a way to reject American law was to regulate itself. Um but but I was trying to understand sort of the way that, the Chinese Benevolent Association, these district associations, but also, later Chinese tongs sort of had various rules about behavior that affected people's lives, not just American law. We see overlap between these two things in interesting ways. One example is so in San Francisco, that's a good example. So the Chinese, in some ways, were both over-policed and under-protected, right? And we see this with lots of populations today. They're over-policed because there's this aggressive discretionary policing of raiding of Chinese houses and things like that. They're under-protected because actually before the Chinatown Squad, which was formed, I'm not remember the exact date, 1880-ish, there was no tax-funded police force in San Francisco that regulated Chinatown. So it was sort of seen as not worth American tax dollars to have a police force in Chinatown. So instead, what the Chinese had to do was to pay for private policing, and that's what they did. They hired white men, often white men who had been police officers before and then they were understood and are like labeled in documents as police officers, but they're being paid by the Chinese, which is interesting. Chinese elites paid for white policing in Chinatown in order to cut down on, I think both crime within the community and outside. So we see this interesting overlap. I think also, yeah, I'll stop there because I saw other questions. Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Yes. Yep.
Hi, Professor Lew-Williams. I'm Steve. I'm history major here, so I'm like senior. My question regarding the anonymity you mentioned in the beginning of the talk. So, like, one observation I made about like new Chinese immigrants coming to the country is that after they naturalize, they tend to like change their name, original name, into like a typical white English name, like Emily or David, whatever.
Yeah.
I used to really hate that, but now I wonder like, do you think it is possible that's like a protective mechanism by the Chinese immigrants to overcome this anonymity imposed by the society around like to them? And also, like, while you were conducting this research, did you encounter any like efforts by the Chinese community to overcome this like Doe Chinaman?
Mm. Hmm. I think, like you, I would be speculating why it is. It's definitely a phenomenon that people choose like an English or Americanized name for themselves, and sometimes it's the dominant name that they go by today. Why, I think for many different reasons, but in part to make themselves more legible, right, in an English speaking community. I think that sometimes this is anecdotal, but I see this happen, in a classroom or something. If someone is uncomfortable pronouncing someone's name, they're less likely to just say the name, right? And I think that can cause all sorts of very subtle forms of alienation, like in a classroom, and it's unfortunate. Whether people were doing this at the time, It's a great question, but I don't know the answer to it. We definitely see Americanized names. So John Chinaman, John Doe, Charlie Chinaman, Mary Chinaman. There's some of these, but whether those are being adopted by people, or Panny Lowe, uh, adopted by people or sort of placed on them by outsiders is unclear to me. I would have to think longer to see if I've ever seen an example where someone articulates where they got that Americanized name. I don't know. Yeah, yeah.
Your description of all the anti-Chinese laws and also what appears to be selective prosecution of vagrancy or nuisance laws or what have you is making me think about this as a surveillance state. And I wondered if you've read any accounts or people have reflected on this experience of living in this surveillance state.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing that they're anonymous and yet so highly visible, right? The Chinese are the largest non-white population in all of these states until 1910. When they're surpassed by the Japanese, and in 1920 they're surpassed by Black people, right? So, but before that, living in white society, I should say, they're the largest community. So I think they're very visible, uh, and for in that way, policeable. I mean, I think I talked for a second about the tax collector, and that's an example maybe of the surveillance that you're talking about. So there was one of the best known sets of laws against the Chinese are foreign minor taxes. So with the gold rush, uh, there was a series of laws that said that foreign miners needed to pay $4 a month for the right to mine in the gold mines. These laws targeted foreign miners, and eventually it targeted, those foreign miners that could not naturalize explicitly. It says those, and what this meant in practice, if you look at the diary, is it's a diary of Charles DeLong, who later became a state representative. He would just take a bunch of blank licenses that he got, like 100 blank licenses. He'd fill out every one to Chinaman ahead of time, and then he would just roam his district, his county, Yuba County, looking for Chinese. And he said to sell these to, is the way he put it. And so if he found a Chinese person, he would then ask for $4. If they had $4 and gave it to him, he would just give them the receipt every month. This happened every month. But it was hard sometimes. Chinese don't want to be found by the tax collector, so he would, bring backup and descend on a camp at night. And if people were not able to give him money or would not give him money, he would take their goods, which was written into the law. And so it gives a sense of just like, even as you're gold mining, at any time you can be set upon by people that are tax collectors, or there's also fraudulent tax collectors, people that just, this is like, and for a Chinese person, it's often difficult to tell a difference. What is a robbery and what is the tax collector? Yes.
So earlier you mentioned the boarding house law and other laws as like appearing as virtually neutral on the surface, and I was like curious on how you and the algorithm, I guess, were able to classify this as anti-Chinese. So like, was it as easy as parsing out like Chinaman or Chinese, or were there deeper systematic patterns in legal language that you came across?
Yeah. Okay. It is definitely more complicated. And one of the things that we did, so I'm not the first one to look at local laws. What we try to do is look at them at a scale that people had never looked at them. But there, for example, Charles McLean, who's a professor of law at Berkeley, or Jack Chin at UC Davis in the law school, have looked at these laws before. And so we started with what have scholars found before. And they had found, for example, that these lodging house laws and cubic air laws were disproportionately applied to the Chinese. And in that case, there's huge documentation. It's very, very clear that these are anti-Chinese laws because people were very explicit about it when they were passing them. It's written about. That was a political cartoon showing images of Chinese rated for the cubic air laws, and then we can look at arrest records to see how they're applied. And so in that case, what we do is we look for all the key words. We look for cubic and air, and we look for lodging and boarding and all these variations. And then we ask the computer with the machine learning, right? So you say, this is what we're looking for. Bring us all the laws. We tell them what key terms. And then once we have a certain number of laws, we then feed it back into the machine and say, okay, if these are the laws we have, these are affirmative, these are the correct laws, then can you go find things that seem similar, right, in the data set that might use slightly different words, what is associated. And that's one of the ways that we found additional laws that might be phrased slightly differently, use terms slightly differently. And then you need the human, right? So then I read every single law that the machine pulled out, because it pulled out a lot more than 5,000 laws. It pulled out something like 9,000 laws, and I read every single one to check, because key terms don't always work, right? I learned that there are, the Chinese pheasant was highly regulated, things like that. So I want to make sure that these are actually applied and meaningful. They're not just sort of keyword mistakes along the way. Yep. Yes, sir.
Can you tell me, is the Japanese experience very different than the Chinese experience, or was there an overlap? I mean, certainly in periods of time, with World War II, the Japanese were bad, the Chinese were good. So can you just tell me?
Yeah. I talk mostly about the Chinese because they're the earlier migration. They come in large numbers before the Japanese. And these histories are related to each other. It's after Chinese exclusion really slows down Chinese migration, but California and other places continue to need the labor, right? The Japanese immigration spikes, and they start filling these jobs. So Japanese immigration doesn't really take off until the 1890s. So these early laws really are very Chinese focused because they are the sort of non-white population, as I said, the largest non-white population in these states. But once the Japanese start arriving, some of these laws are applied to the Japanese as well. Most clearly, those alien laws, the ones that are based on citizenship, also applied to the Japanese because the Japanese also could not naturalize and become U.S. citizens. And so alien land laws, which originally were used against the Chinese, became even more so applied against Japanese. And we see this very much in agriculture as Japanese farmers really start doing very well in California, and there's attempts to regulate that. There are interesting divergences, though, that happen in part because of the very different geopolitics involved. An example is school segregation. The history of school segregation is very complicated, with the Chinese sometimes being unable to attend public school at all, and at other times segregated in public schools. But the Japanese, San Francisco attempted at some point to apply the Chinese segregation law against the Japanese as well, and it set off an international incident at a time in the I think it was in 1904-ish, when the U.S. and Japan were very much collaborating, right? And so there was concern that San Francisco, by offending the Japanese, would set off, sour the relationship between the U.S. and Japan. And so they actually backed off and did not segregate Japanese students in San Francisco, and it was sort of brokered at that time. So we see this. It's interesting how sometimes they overlap and sometimes they're really quite different. And the difference often has to do with the geopolitics there.
You talk about how the Chinese and then the Japanese weren't able to gain citizenship. You talked about the gentleman who had his hair cut, so we kind of couldn't go back to China. How was it seen? Were people coming here for better work opportunities? How do we think of them compared to other immigrants who've come over? Was it that they thought that they were coming here to send money back to their families, or were they trying to establish citizenship? So what was that dynamic of migration and homeland?
Many of the Chinese in the 19th century came over thinking that they were on a round trip journey, for sure. They, they were they were trying to, yes, they were looking for opportunity, much like other immigrants, but because of cultural norms and then later because of laws, discriminatory laws, Chinese women, for the most part, stayed behind. And so often these were young men. I feel like it's amazing having my professor here. I'm, I remember learning this in the classroom. Okay. But I can still, I can, um, young men who, sort of lower middle class, sort of not the poorest of the poor, who had the resources. First, they would move to like the bigger cities, from villages to like Guangzhou, and then take the leap overseas, and not just to the United States, but also to Australia, Southeast Asia. Um, so yes, a lot of them pictured their trip as a round trip, and this was understood at the time. And one of the sort of stereotypes that was used against the Chinese at the time, like they don't even want to be here, like they're temporary, they're just going to like take their money and run. Was sort of and in fact, they were paying huge amounts of taxes. So they were not taking their, as a side note, they were not taking their money and run. The foreign miners tax netted California $5 million. At some years, that was 20% of state revenue in California was from the Chinese through the foreign miners tax. So they were paying lots of taxes. This reminds us of immigrants today, right? However, when they came over here, some people definitely did want to stay. Some people came with families. You have people that, even if they didn't want to die here, they would stay decades and decades, the old timers. Um, and I think that the issue of citizenship, they wanted citizenship even whether they were going to stay or not, right? Because citizenship was a series of rights and privileges. So even if you don't think of this is the place that you want to settle and die in, you want the access that citizenship would bring. And so I think in some ways it doesn't really matter if how they envisioned their lives. The denial of citizenship was still really impactful. Yes.
Hi, thank you. This is so great. So these communities are spread across the West, and they're acting, pushing against these different racialized laws. Were they ever coordinating with each other, or are these sort of like individual forms of resistance?
Were the Chinese coordinated together? Yes, they certainly were coordinated. To what extent can we tell? Like be able to tell is unclear. So, the 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 district associations, the Huagan, the Chinese Benevolent Association, these were community organizations based on their native place in China, and they were actually highly organized in what they were doing. And they did things like run what they called subscription campaigns at the time, which is when they were trying to fight a law, sometimes they would basically ask every member of these districts to pay $1 in. So an example of this, one of my students found actually, Alex Jin, he was looking at the Gary Act, so the law that had all Chinese people register as part of Chinese exclusion, register and have to carry papers to show that they were able to stay in the country. To fight that law, Alex found that they were fundraising, asking every single person to pay in to this legal challenge. And I think that we only see it in that as an example, but I kind of think that was happening more broadly, and that gives a sense of the coordination. I think I'll stop with that. Okay.
Thank you very much.